Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a highly respected celebrity biographer and award-winning journalist whose meticulous research, attention to detail, and exceptional, insightful storytelling make his books fascinating, compelling, and memorable. His insightful books about some of the iconic artists in the world of popular music include Intimate Nights, The Golden Age of New York Cabaret, Deep in a Dream, The Long Night of Chet Baker, Stormy Weather, The Life of Lena Horne, and Is That All There Is? The Strange Life of Peggy Lee. And now he's released his much anticipated fifth book entitled George Michael, A Life, a poignant and eye-opening biography which has been hailed as the definitive account of the tumultuous, triumphant, and yet tragic life story of one of pop music's most troubled and enigmatic superstars. Behind the carefully crafted public image of a sexy straight stud, a modern-day Elvis, if you will, there was a frightened, lonely, insecure gay man who felt like a fraud. People magazine chose this book as one of its top 10 summer reads, and the New York Times called it an engrossing, thorough, and well-rounded view of George Michael's artistry and personal chaos. In addition to his books, our guest has written dozens of New York Times feature articles, and he's received 2 ASCAP awards for excellence in music journalism and a Grammy nomination. I'm delighted to welcome James Gavin to our show. James, thank you so much for being here.
Harvey, you've paid me an incredible honor. Thank you so very much for having me.
Well, the honor is mine, James. I absolutely loved your book, not only because of the insights you gave us into George Michael's personality and career, but because as a 66-year-old gay man who came out in the late 70s and paid a heavy price for doing that, I see your book as an important piece of gay history, not just pop music history. Do you agree?
The really important stories do exactly what you said. I could have told George Michael's story as his story, starting at the beginning and ending at the end, but George Michael's life is about so many huge issues. The ones that you mentioned and other ones, such as the stranglehold that big record companies had on artists in George Michael's era, and the last age of big record company sovereignty in pop music, whereby without a good relationship with a big record label, you were considered to be nothing. George's story is epic.
Now, as we all know, in the 80s, George Michael had the image of a butch, stubbly, leather-jacketed pinup boy, a real stud, who was decidedly straight and was one of the hottest pop stars in the world. And he was petrified that people would find out he was gay. To what degree do you think having a homophobic, unsupportive father contributed to his insecurities and low self-esteem?
I would say that all of those things not only spurred him on to prove his father wrong and reach the absolute top, but then they contributed to his undoing later on, because the curse of self-hatred grew ever larger in George until he took, unfortunately, fatal efforts to quiet it down.
Did the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s contribute to George Michael's decision not to come out at that time?
Oh, I think without a doubt it did. George was terrified of coming out for many reasons. One of them is that, like many, if not most, if not all superstars, George craved the love of millions of people, and that was supposed to fill the empty space inside him. It was supposed to make him feel so loved that he felt good about himself at last. And in order to reach that stratosphere, he knew that there were steps that had to be taken. He was coming up in the mid-80s. AIDS was everywhere. George would pass newsstands in London with the Sun and the Daily Mail, covers of those tabloids, screaming out AIDS horror stories. George could not, in his mind, ever possibly risk coming out, because it would destroy everything that he had fought so hard to attain.
I'm intrigued by the relationship between George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley, who was not gay, very self-confident, but frankly, he was lazy and he didn't have a great voice or much musical ability. Sorry, Andrew. So, why was George Michael, who was so talented and ambitious, why did he choose to team up with Andrew Ridgeley?
If it were not for Andrew Ridgeley, there might very well never have been a George Michael, and there certainly would not have been a Wham. Andrew and George were classmates in North London, and Andrew saw this pimply, nerdy kid, terribly insecure, and he befriended him. George saw in Andrew this guy who had super developed confidence and swagger. He had a cool aloofness about him. He had a fashion sense. He was a together guy, and he was a magnet for everybody. And George saw a template in Andrew of what he wanted to be. And so Wham started, and George's persona initially was heavily based on who Andrew really was. So, although Andrew has gotten a harsh rap over the years for not having contributed much musically to Wham, again, if it weren't for Andrew, Wham would just never have happened.
I was really surprised to read in your book that although Careless Whisper was one of Wham's biggest hits, George Michael didn't really like the song. Do you know why?
How could you not love that song?
I know.
It is kitschy in a way. It is schmaltzy. It reminds me of soundtrack music for a Lifetime intimate portrait. But at the same time, it is nasty and hot, and it's sexy, and it has enormous, so many adjectives. It just has enormous seduction about it. A lot of that centers on this saxophone solo that George wrote, and that has become and remains one of the most instantly identifiable sax solos in all of popular music, played by a man named Steve Gregory. Quick story: when George was set to record Careless Whisper, he had as producer the great Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records, one of the most acclaimed and successful record producers in all of pop music history. And Jerry Wexler filled the session with slick studio musicians, including a sax player who had been imported from Los Angeles, to play that solo. And George heard the finished results, and he knew that they weren't right. It sounded very studio. It sounded very precise. George wanted something dirtier. He wanted something more nasty and sexual to tell that story. And so, after having auditioned many saxophone players, he found a British guy named Steve Gregory. And when he heard that sound, he knew that that was the sound that Careless Whisper needed, and you know the rest.
But why didn't George like the song?
I don't know why George didn't like the song. He probably thought that it was schmaltzy. In fact, I believe he did think that it was schmaltzy and a bit cheap, as he would later think of a lot of the Wham period repertoire. However, Careless Whisper made the first line, or at the very least the second line, of all the obituaries. People, that song is tattooed on people's brains. That saxophone solo has not been forgotten in, goodness gracious, going on 40 years.
When Wham broke up, George Michael told the British press that Wham had been an exercise in ignoring his own intelligence. Was he suggesting that he sacrificed his musical credibility to become successful and famous?
Yes, that's exactly what he was suggesting. George at that point wanted to grow up. He did not want to be identified as a boy band member. One of the big issues that George had in his white-hot period of solo success, which would have been roughly 1986 to 91, he wanted to be perceived as a grown-up. Wham had stamped him as a teeny bopper idol. One of George's great inspirations was David Cassidy. And while George borrowed a lot from David Cassidy, George didn't want to be perceived as a child making fluff pop music. He wanted to be taken seriously, and it took him many years to achieve that. We'll get to that port. By the very last tour that George did, called Symphonica, which is a beautiful, somber, autobiographical show with symphony orchestra that never came to the U.S., George had finally made it. But we'll get to that part later.
I want to ask you about how George Michael handled fame. As you know, he became extremely famous by the age of 20. George Martin, the Beatles producer, said that although George Michael's songwriting was phenomenal, he achieved success too soon, and it went to his head. And having an arrogant superstar attitude can be very dangerous in the long run. James, do you agree that part of George Michael's problem was that he made it too big too soon in his life?
Oh, I think his problems went far deeper than that, Harvey. To answer your question, no. Most pop superstars who make it that big are very young when it happens. Of course, they're ill prepared for the fine print in the deal that they make with the devil. None of them want to think that there are going to be big prices to pay for this thing that they lusted after. The problem with George was, again, self-hatred. It was instilled in him from childhood. One of my favorite interviews in the book is David Geffen. David Geffen is smart and tough as hell. And he pointed out to me that if you don't like yourself, if you don't like what you see in the mirror, then no amount of screams from thousands upon thousands of girls in a stadium is going to change that opinion. People will tell you how hot you are and what a genius you are, and it's probably not going to sink in, at least not for very long. And in fact, you will wind up, as George did, feeling like a fraud because you don't feel that way about yourself, and you mistrust people who say those things to you.
As you know, George would often complain about being so famous, and Frank Sinatra sent a public letter to George scolding him and telling him to stop complaining about stardom. But when I look back at what George was actually saying, I'm wondering whether he was complaining about the pitfalls of fame, or was he complaining about not being able to control his fame?
Can anyone control their fame? I suppose we could look to there have been certain stars that I admire for having spectacularly well-managed careers and of being on top of everything. I'll name two names, Doris Day and Julie Andrews. These women managed their stardom with incredible finesse. They maintained their public personas intact from the beginning until the end. In George's case, George, I think, was done in partly by his absolute lust for being number one. That is how deep his need was. He needed everybody the world over to love him, and when he started to slide from that pedestal, as all superstars do, it was a huge blow to him because he took it very, very personally. He was not able to transition the way certain pop stars can into being artists, first and foremost, and making the music they want to make for the audience that they have. George was desperate to be loved.
There was a lot of negative media backlash to the song I Want Your Sex because it was released at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and the song was perceived as contradicting the messaging to promote safe sex. I know the song was a huge hit, but what do you make of the fact that George Michael wanted to titillate people with a song about sex, while at the same time he was desperately trying to keep his own sexuality a secret?
George was very, very calculating, and I'm certain that he knew the controversy that song would bring. I Want Your Sex came around in 1986, and it wasn't only safe sex that was being drummed into the minds of people the world over, but it was a very sex-phobic age period. You ideally were not supposed to have sex at all back then,
Or be monogamous.
I would go a step further than that and say that sex itself had such an incredible stigma at that time that not only monogamy, but I'm thinking back to those years. I was a quite young man when all of that was happening, and I was reading a lot about AIDS and a lot about safe sex and seeing the absolute confusion that was in the air and the terror that was associated with sex at all. Here came George Michael with a song that was telling young people who were his fans, sex is natural, sex is good, not everybody does it, but everybody should. Absolutely counter to what people were being told in the AIDS era. George, after the backlash took place, which by the way didn't hurt the success of that song, it was a huge hit, but George then had to do a bit of damage control and insist that that song was actually a message about monogamy. I don't think that that was his original thought. All in all, he was basking in the notoriety and in the record sales, and that is the song that set him on his path to number one as a solo artist.
James, you described Elton John as a fatherly cheerleader and a gay surrogate father for George Michael, but they were both extremely ambitious and they wanted to be number one. Did that affect their friendship?
Oh, God, yes. It didn't affect it fatally for quite a few years. Elton was very competitive and very jealous. I wouldn't characterize George in quite the same way. Elton was older, and George looked up to Elton John as being a great master, the king of British pop. How could George ever possibly compete with that? However, George was bigger than Elton John in the late 80s. And there was always this competitive tension between them, I would say. It was only in much later years when their lives diverged dramatically and Elton cleaned up his act, conquered his addictions, and created this stable, seemingly stable family life, and George went off the tracks. And that's when his addictions really kicked in, and Elton spent years trying to convince George to clean up, and George didn't want to hear it. And that basically is what finally did their friendship in.
Well, Elton John finally came out in 1992. Why do you think George Michael didn't come out at that time as well?
He was afraid. He was terrified. First of all, he had been in the closet for so long. You know how it is when certain big gay celebrities, the longer they stay in the closet, the harder it is for them to come out, because everybody knows, everyone's been gossiping about it and trying to pry it out of them, and they stubbornly cling to the inside of the closet door and start making a lot of excuses. George was afraid. He was terrified of losing what he had. His career was at that period we're talking about, that the years immediately prior to George's Beverly Hills men's room incident. More on that in a moment. By the early 90s, the British tabloid press and the other tabloids worldwide were not doing what they had been doing, which is pairing George with beautiful girls in these fictitious romances that provided titillating tidbits for gossip columns. By this time, they were on to him, and George was determined not to give them what they wanted. The way he ultimately chose to come out, subconscious though it may have been, was most unfortunate.
Well, let me ask you this. In the 90s, we saw a lot of female stars come out. Ellen DeGeneres, Rosie O'Donnell, K.D. Lang, Melissa Etheridge, Janice Ian, and others. But Barry Manilow and Johnny Mathis didn't come out until 2017. Barry was 73, Johnny was 82. Do you think it's harder for male stars to come out than for female stars?
It seems to be. Pronouncing that one is a lesbian, I'm not sure I know the reasons why, Harvey, but I would say that the lesbians suffered much less damage than the gay guys did. Now, by the way, I didn't know about John. Did Johnny Mathis ever say, "I'm gay"?
Yep, he came out.
Isn't that something? Well, score one for Johnny. Johnny was, of course, the voice of heterosexual romance, a neutered kind of voice, not a sexual presence, but a romantic presence for his entire career. He was also black. He came from a religious background. There was a lot of homophobia in those household settings. And he came up in he started in 1956-57 when that was truly the love that dare not speak its name. Johnny Mathis had a lot of reasons for avoiding that revelation for many, many years, even after everybody kind of knew. In George Michael's case, however, the problem with George is that, first of all, he created a George Michael character that was this leather-jacketed, torn jeans wearing, hyper butch biker dude. A completely at the same time, that was a heterosexual sex image and also a gay, iconic gay image as well, that George Michael's millions of young female fans didn't get. They took that all very seriously. George had in his mind a lot to lose by telling the truth.
George Michael performed at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert for AIDS awareness in April 1992. James, it's heartbreaking to me to think that George's own boyfriend, Anselmo Felipa, was suffering from AIDS at that time, and no one knew it. I can't even imagine how hard that performance must have been for George.
He knew that he was about to lose this angel from on high, which is how he perceived Anselmo. George, up until they met in Rio in 1991, was a terribly lonely man. Imagine the irony of standing on arena stages with millions of people screaming for you and still feeling all alone. It fascinates me, that aspect of show business. I have written about many of the grand singing ladies of the stage, and it touches me to think that many of those women, if not most of them, who were considered to be oracles of romance and worldly wisdom, were up on stage singing love songs to strangers about men that they did not have in their lives. There's a great poignancy to that. George Michael had some of that poignancy because he truly felt that he had boxed himself into a cage with his ambitions that would make it impossible for him to ever find real love. And he found it, and it was snatched away from him by AIDS.
Now, it's well known that George became very unhappy with his record company, Sony, and he sued them and he lost that lawsuit. What exactly was it about his contract with Sony that made him so unhappy?
It wasn't the contract so much. It was that George was unhappy with himself. He was unhappy with fame. He was unhappy with the George Michael character. It had not brought him the happiness that he wanted, that he was sure it would. And so that period of George's life was one of trying to tear down the life that he had created for himself. That contract was fair and square. It was a standard record company contract with terms that were very, very sweet for George Michael. George had signed it with expert legal advice, and then retroactively he tried to go back and say, I've been had. You let me down. You didn't fulfill the terms of the contract. None of which I believe.
At the trial, George testified that Sony had deliberately failed to promote his album Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1 in the United States to teach him a lesson. What lesson did he think Sony wanted to teach him?
It was an unwinnable case, Harvey. In order to get out of that contract, he and his lawyers had to create a case. They had to create claims. George was furious because Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1, his second solo album, had sold half of what Faith, its blockbuster predecessor, had sold. Faith had sold about 15 million worldwide. Listen Without Prejudice sold about half of that. and 7.5 million copies worldwide is still a phenomenal success. But George was just a very unhappy man. He was trying to deconstruct, as he does in the Freedom 90 video, he was trying to destruct the George Michael that people knew and get at some kind of truth, to decimate the playing field and start from scratch. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way.
Well, Prince and Don Henley also sued their record labels and eventually reconciled with their record companies. In the 30s, Betty Davis sued Warner Brothers, lost her lawsuit, and reconciled with that studio, and went on to make the greatest movies of her career at that studio. Why do you think George Michael just couldn't do the same?
Why do I think he couldn't come to terms again with Sony and clear up the disagreements and move forward? Because even after he had lost, he was furious and he felt wronged. That was a period of George's life in which he felt very wronged by people, wronged by the record business, wronged by the universe. Anselmo died in 1993. Right around that time when that trial was on track and heating up. George has said that one of the reasons that he pursued that case with such ferocity is that he was angry that Anselmo had been taken away from him. That was the root of a lot of the anger that George was feeling at that time. He had to vent it somehow. And he did something that was very destructive to his career. He did not release a new album in 1991, 2, 3, 4, 5. In 1996, my favorite George Michael album, Older, came out. But in that time, he was replaced. Pop music, especially at that level, is highly ephemeral. It's hard to hang on to it. And George never reclaimed the majesty of his American career.
Well, you see, in reading your book, I understood all of what you're saying. And it seemed to me that the anger and grief over the death of his partner manifested itself in an overinflated ego combined with a seeming inability to write blockbuster hit songs anymore. I mean, what happened to his creative energy?
What is an overinflated ego but a way of overcompensating for what's wrong in your life or the inadequacies that you feel?
Mm-hmm.
In George's case, I would say addiction did him in. After Anselmo died, and then even more so when his mother, beloved mother, Leslie, died of cancer in 1997, George felt that these two cornerstones of his life had been taken away from him. He really felt victimized. And so he was getting high a lot. He started out with pot. He became a full-time stoner. That's how he got through the process of doing the Older album. But then he moved on to the harder stuff. And the harder stuff is what ultimately destroyed him. Imagine waking up every day not being able to face the world unmedicated. That is how George was feeling, and it really screwed with his creativity. He himself said that even though the Older album depended a lot on the fact that he'd been able to get high in order to get through it, it also wrecks your ambition. It dampens your motivation. And George was stuck. The pain inside him was just so deep, Harvey. When the pain is gnawing away at you that heavily, you look for ways to medicate it.
Oh, I understand that. Your book makes it abundantly clear that despite all his success and fame and fortune, George Michael was essentially a desperately lonely and unhappy person. And yet he seemed to always be surrounded by an entourage of friends who boosted his ego. They enabled his substance abuse. Do you think he had any really sincere friends who actually cared about him?
Yes, he had a handful of them, but what they were able to do to save him is marginal because I don't think anybody could have saved George. Yes, of course, as you say, when you are a superstar of that magnitude and level of wealth, you will have a lot of people around you who are either on the payroll or like being around you because you're George Michael. It's hard sometimes to tell the difference. And in George's case, he he did have people around him who really cared. He had a wonderful manager named Andy Stevens, who was with him from 1995 until, if memory serves, 2000 and let's see, 13? No, yeah, about that. And it's funny, Harvey, sometimes these dates and facts that I scrupulously researched in my book, I now have to look them up in my own book to remember them. But George George fired Andy Stevens because Andy was being too honest with him at a time when George did not want to hear the truth. If you tried to tell George the truth, there was a good chance you would be 86th.
Well, here's the hard part now for me. As we all know, George Michael was basically forced out of the closet in 1998 after being arrested at a park in Beverly Hills for lewd conduct in a public washroom. James, were you shocked that such a big star who was so obsessed about his secrecy and his public image would engage in such reckless and self-sabotaging behavior?
Well, at the time that it happened, I remember it so well. Harvey, that was April of 1998. And mainly because of the older album, I was really interested in George Michael. I was aware of the fact that the older album had flopped in the US, not in the UK, but in the US. And that made me feel somehow protective of that album and of George. And I knew that George had slid from his pedestal. And then 2 years passed, and there, as breaking news, and it was breaking news, it was cut into the 6 o'clock news and the 11 o'clock news, and it was on newspaper and tabloid covers. And I have right here is a VCR because I still have VHS tapes, and on my VCR, I was recording the George Michael television appearances that he did as Damage Control on MTV, on VH1, on CNN, notably, a very deep one on CNN. And I watched how George handled this disaster. He had to somehow justify his actions. But most of all, he had to justify why he had stayed in the closet for so long. And although he was trying to appear witty and not casual, but relaxed about the whole thing and in control, I knew that he was dying inside.
Well, if he had not been arrested, do you think he ever would have come out?
He himself said that he probably would not have. Interesting, huh?
Yeah. Well, many people may not be aware that George Michael was extremely generous, and he gave many millions of dollars to charities, and he helped a lot of people in financial need, and he did it anonymously and without bravado. I'm really glad, James, that you highlighted this in your book because it's important for people to know about this side of him.
Isn't it beautiful, Harvey, that he had this sincere and powerful drive to help people, even though he lived in a stratosphere of wealth and celebrity known to very few. He still somehow had his feet on the ground. I think by that time George had been kicked in the stomach so many times that he really knew he was able to empathize with people who were in trouble, friends who were in trouble. He had one musician friend whose rehab he paid for over and over because it wasn't taking, and so George loved this man and wanted so much for him to go clean. He would hear about strangers in need on television shows, and he would make a phone call and find out who they were and help them. He had organizations like Project Angel Food that more or less Meals on Wheels assistance service for people with HIV and AIDS based in Hollywood. That was a charity of George's. I think that by the late 90s, when his music career had really gone off track, this was a way for him to feel worthwhile.
Well, I'm really glad that you pointed it out. It was something that a lot of people didn't know about him. Now, in The Guardian, Jim White referred to George Michael as a grand contradiction, a songwriter of real depth, compromised by an addiction to the superficial, the glamorous, and the unreal. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, that article is wonderfully written, beautifully stated, very perceptive. Again, when George set his sights on superstardom, not stardom, but superstardom, he wanted to be the biggest star in the world, and he made it there for a moment. Does anyone stop to think of the price you're going to pay for that? George didn't. All George saw or wanted to see was that everybody loved him and thought that he was great. So it makes what followed all the more poignant, because imagine feeling so empty inside that you have no inner foundation. When things go wrong, you have really nothing to lean on in order to get you through. I've known many people like that on a much smaller scale. I've known singers, I've known artists, I've known people who based their entire self-esteem on what people on the outside are thinking and saying about them. And when something goes wrong with that, they have nothing inside to get them through. That was the George Michael story.
In 2004, George teamed up with British film director Selwyn Morris to make a documentary about his life called George Michael, A Different Story. In that film, he makes a heartbreaking statement that left me absolutely dumbstruck. He said, "It's very hard to be proud of your sexuality when it hasn't given you any joy." That statement is incredibly telling about how he dealt with being gay, don't you think?
I do. There's another example of just that sort of thing. It took place in 2000 at a huge LGBT concert in DC called Equality Rocks. And this was 2 years after George had outed himself in the way we discussed. And he was one of many LGBT, gay and lesbian stars who had agreed to appear in this concert. It was kind of a big deal at that time. Garth Brooks was also going to be there, who of course is not gay, but he was going to sing with George. And so it was a joyous celebration of newfound freedoms and hope for the future that George was unable to feel. He was there. He was one of the biggest stars on the bill, if not the biggest star. And he looked out at a sea of joyful, celebratory gay people and lesbians, and it must have made him feel terribly sad, because he delivered a 7 or 8 minute monologue on all the ways that the music business and gay life too had disappointed him. He was incapable of feeling that joy. And when George died, Elton John said that he didn't feel George had ever been happy being gay, and I think that that's an indisputable insight.
Well, as we know, George was found dead in his bed on Christmas Day 2016. There's been a lot of speculation about how he died. Based on your research, James, what do you think was the cause of death?
I think that, well, the official cause of death was heart failure. What does heart failure mean? It means your heart stops working. I believe his last partner, Fadi Fawaz, who is otherwise not someone to be believed too deeply, but Fadi said that George had tried to commit suicide a number of times, had never made it. but George had been committing slow suicide for many years at that point. All that he had put his body through, all the hard drugs. He was highly overweight in the last months of his life. He smoked. He had taken terrible care of himself. But most of all, he was just done. He was done. He didn't see any substantial music making ahead for him. He was in a relationship that he wanted to get out of but hadn't. There was nothing left for George Michael at that point. And as Kenny Goss, the boyfriend who had been with him prior to Fadi, said, and this makes perfect sense to me, after all he'd put himself through, his body just gave out. I think that's closest to the truth of what happened.
It's just such a tragedy. As you know, a documentary film called Freedom, which George was working on before his death, was released in 2017. And a few months ago, an extended, uncut version of the film was released. James, what did you think of it?
Well, I like the fact that it shines a spotlight on his music, lets you see the George Michael magic captured in beautiful video clips. And one of the other things I like very much about that film are the archival clips, the home movies of him with Anselmo, during that 6-month window of time in which you can see the two of them truly happy. You can see George projecting real joy, which he so seldom did. I like all of that. I don't think the film gets at too much truth, though, of why George turned out the way he did, why things went the way they did. I think the film has a very slick infomercial quality to it. And I wanted to dig deeper. I'm so interested in psychology, Harvey. I wanted to see if I could get inside George's head and find out why this spectacularly handsome and gifted man had gone so off the rails so as to end up the way that he did. I do want to add one thing, though, if I may, to something you said a moment ago. And that is that George is not ultimately, and this is miraculous, but he's not perceived as a tragic figure. For all the tragedy in his life, including the early demise, whenever I've mentioned the name George Michael to anybody, they react with a big smile. I can see warmth come over their faces, and they think, oh, they don't think, they say, I love George Michael. And then they name a song that they love, or a video, or a moment in their lives that George provided the soundtrack for. And I think, isn't that marvelous that that is the side of George Michael that won out in people's hearts?
Yes, in the same way that when we think of Judy Garland, a smile comes on my face and I think of all the beautiful movies and the great songs. But the beauty of your book is that you allowed us to get inside the personality, the psyche. You did an enormous amount of research for this book. It's very comprehensive. So let me ask you this then, James, to sum it up. When you look at George Michael's life and his legacy, what's the fundamental message you want to convey to your readers about him?
Let's see. The
You
first
want me
thing
to
that
tell you
pops-
what my message was, what I got out of it?
I do, please.
I think the book is a cautionary tale about fame and the price you pay when you try to suppress who you really are.
It is absolutely that. But there's something else that I would like people to take away with them, and that is empathy. Empathy. It's easy to look at George and see someone who is so privileged, with every possible advantage, gift, and not feel any compassion for him for screwing things up. You have to look deeper than that, though. The big question for any biographer, in my view, is why. More than what, it's why. You have to get at the root causes of why people's lives unfolded the way they did. And you have to, if you're writing a story or a book about someone like George, anyone who went through terrible struggles and knew so much trouble in their lives, you have to find things in yourself that enable you to understand what they were going through. That is the meaning of empathy. And without that, you have no business telling that story.
That's beautifully put. And I think what you helped me understand was the reasons for the choices he made. Because so much of life is choice, especially when you have a career like that. And I really can't tell you how much I appreciate this book. I want to tell our viewers that you can find out all about James Gavin and his books and articles by going to his website, www.jamesgavin.com. Well, James, I want to thank you so much for writing the book, for giving us such tremendous insight into George Michael. I was a fan of his before reading your book, but now I have a lot more empathy and compassion for him. And I thank you for that. And I thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
And I want to thank you for reading my book with so much care and taking the time to ask insightful and intelligent questions that really made me think. It's a joy to speak with you, and I thank you so much for this time.
Well, thank you, James. That means a lot. Our guest has been James Gavin, author of George Michael, A Life, which is available everywhere books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.